All right, welcome everyone to our last event of the semester. Thank you for taking what appears to be the very last warm Friday that we'll have for quite a while to come and be here with us. I'm, for the few of you that don't know me, I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I teach in the history department at NYU, and I'm the director of the Remark Institute. And I'm delighted to get the chance to introduce Sandrine Kott to speak to us today about her newest book, which is the fruit of a decade of research and the synthesis of many, many more years of thinking about labor, internationalism, social welfare, power relations, transnational and global politics, and the East-West divide in Europe. The book is called A World More Equal, an Internationalist Perspective on the Cold War, and it is out very soon with Columbia University Press. Now, Sandrine, who is a key voice in international history and in the history of labor, is a full professor in modern European history at the University of Geneva and a visiting professor at NYU since 2017. She's here with us every fall semester. She's very much a friend of Remark and also a key voice in our discussions in this room here. As you already know, her main fields of expertise include the history of social welfare in France and Germany since the 19th century, and labor relations and power relations in those countries across the two sides of the East-West divide, notably the German Democratic Republic. She's been working on transnational and global dimensions of these problems in the last decade, and I think part of the work that has gone into this book relating to her projects on the International Labour Organization has to do with this question of the international status of social welfare. Sandrine has published nearly 100 articles in French, German, and English-speaking journals and collective volumes, as well as 7 books, of which the most recent is the book Organiser le Monde, from which A World More Equal is translated, and before that, Das Deutsche Kaiserreich in Europa from 2014. She's also the editor of several books, most recently with Karen Patel, Nazism Across Borders, The Social Policies of the Third Reich and Their Global Appeal, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2018, and with Michel Christian and André Matejka, Planning in Cold War Europe, Competition, Cooperation, and Circulation from 2018 as well. Now, to discuss the book with Sandrine after her opening presentation, we have first Molly Nolan, who is professor of history emerita at New York University and was my even official mentor in my many years in this. We had this sort of tradition of being marked with a mentor at the university.
And also my former professor.
Oh, I did not know that. So isn't
it's getting incestuous here.
Yeah. This is an exam. So, and she was the author of The Transatlantic Century, Europe and America, 1890 through 2010, as well as Visions of Modernity, American Business and the Modernization of Germany, which is the work that we all read in graduate school. So, yeah, I'm like, I like, there's lots of things I'm going to cut from here. But more recently, which is much more recently, she's also the author of America's Century in Europe, Reflections on Americanization, Anti-Americanism, and the Transatlantic Partnership, which I only found because I looked online in preparing for today, insofar as it came out in October. So congratulations, Molly, on the American Century in Europe, a subject really identified with you at this point. And also Kristen Ghodsee, who is professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies at UPenn, who will speak second and is the author of 12 books, including Second World, Second Sex, Socialist Women's Activism and Global Solidarity During the Cold War, which came out in 2019. The by now classic, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and Other Arguments for Economic Independence from 2018. And her most recent book, Everyday Utopia, What 2,000 Years of Wild Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life, which appeared in May with Simon & Schuster. So here's how we'll do things. First, Sandrine will speak first, and then Molly and Kristen, and then we'll open it up so that we can see if there's a little bit of conversation that you want to have as a back and forth, and we'll open it up for discussion to the room after that. I want to thank Sam, Paul, and Amy Nguyen and Lauren Bessie for not simply preparing today, but a whole semester's worth of Life at Remark, including all of the events. So thanks to all three of you, one and all. And with that, we can get started.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting, organizing everything, and thank you for coming. I mean, it's very nice to see all these people around me, when I will present a book which has been very long journey in my research. And in particular, I mean, I just want to point to Suzanne because she's here and she was really at the beginning when I was thinking about these kind of topics and so on. So, and it's very nice to see her. It's very nice also to see Kristen, with whom I have been in contact, but we never really had time to exchange. And of course, Molly, who has been my professor when I first came to New York a long, long time ago. So, I mean, that's really a very nice setting, and I'm very happy to be here. So it's very complicated, of course, to just present this book, which is, I think, rich. I can say that. I just want to, overemphasize all the work I've put in that book, but I put a lot of work in that book in between 10 and 20 minutes, but I try to do that. So first of all, this book, A World More Equal, is a translation of the book, the French book, Organiser le Monde. And as you see, the title is different. So that's a history of the change of title is an interesting story in a certain way. So first of all, why Organiser le Monde? Because when I began talking with my publisher, in fact, Le Seuil, back in Paris, and I said that, I wanted to write something which is the history of the period through the eyes of international organization. I mean, he told me no international organization in the title. It's an absolute killer. So, so you really have to come up with something else, which just refers to international organization without quoting international organization. So we had a long period of, thinking about that and so on. It was Patrick Boucheron, and he told me, Organiser le Monde would be good. And I said, oh yes, that's a very good idea. So Organiser le Monde refers to what I'm doing in this book, which means looking at this period through the eyes of international organization. This book is not a history of the Cold War. Is not an history of international organization, is an history of how you can, in a way, write another, it's another history of the Cold War if you look at it from the perspective of international organization. And again, I was not really, I mean, I didn't want to write an history of an international organization. I always say that because I find them a little bit boring, I have to say. And they are boring. Suzanne, they are boring. And also, I didn't want to write something on the Cold War because I also find the Cold War not so interesting after all. So, but bringing both of them together, it made sense for me. And also because when I began working in the archives of the international organization for completely different purposes, I met the Cold War. I couldn't avoid it. So I had to face it in a certain way, but I had to face it in another way because it was with the eyes of international organization. So that's the title of the book, Organiser le Monde. That's also the subtitle of the other book, An Internationalist Perspective of the Cold War, which comes from, this idea of looking at the Cold War from the perspective of international organization. Now, why this change between Organiser le Monde and A World More Equal? First of all, organizing the world is already taken. So I couldn't, it was just like that. So I couldn't translate the title like that. And in a certain way, it was good because, after having written this book and also having read all the reviews, and there were a lot of reviews, I got to the idea that, in fact, what I wanted to say is that this period was more or less a period about global inequality and global or a kind of search for global equality. That was, in fact, the aim of this book. How into kind of new interpretation of what the period of the Cold War is about, if I look at it from the perspective I had, which is the perspective of international organization. Now, what do I mean with international organization? So that's all the archives I went through. I mean, of course, I didn't went through all the archives of all these organization, because big bureaucracies produce a lot of documentation. So, I mean, it's just immense. So I just, look at certain things in these archives and a little bit intuitive, but also because I'm more interested in labor and economic questions. So I was just following this kind of tracks, and also because I wanted to look at the relationship between East and West. So, I just chose in this international organization, kind of pathways that I could follow in order to elaborate my narrative on the Cold War. And also, I have to say there are certain rooms I like better than others when I work in the archive. So, for example, the Ford Foundation, I mean, here in Sleepy Hollow, it's a very nice place. So I like to go there. So I like to study more there. Of course, the ILO, because I love the people there. So, I mean, there are places, you know how we are as historians. I mean, we are also in a certain way following our intuitions are okay. So I have to be very honest about that. So, and what do I look at when I'm look at archives of international organization? I look at international organization as platform, just to try to reach to a kind of wide range of actors. So international organizations are boring, as I said, but the actors inside international organization are not boring. They're very interesting. So, and it's what I did for, of course, the diplomats, but I'm not so interested in diplomats, but I was in particular interested in the international civil servants, and in particular the first generation, because these people are coming from, I will come back to that, from a kind of anti-fascist standpoint, and they are really interested, they are very interested. And the second group of people who I find very interesting are the experts, which are recruited by the officials and are also coming from different backgrounds and are very interesting people. They have a lot of things to say, they have a lot of things to exchange. So what I look what I do by looking at international organization is a connection as well as the dynamics of internationalism. And that's the thing which, and the second thing which I find interesting is that at the beginning, I didn't thought that I would use international organization as actors in my story. I wanted to use them as just platforms for, trying to build a new interpretation of the Cold War. But more and more, maybe because I felt in love with them. I don't know exactly, that's very funny. But more and more, I thought that they were important, in fact, in this period. It's a kind of invisible importance, but they are important in this period because they set agenda, because they are proposing solution and so on and so forth. And if you look and if you follow this solution, it's always complicated, of course. I mean, then you see that it has an influence on a kind of on a lot of national governments and also networks and so on and so forth. So at the end, I thought that my book is not just a book on this period of the Cold War, but also on internationalism itself, and that I really deem important, in fact. And what I discovered that maybe it's one of my hypotheses, it's more as an hypothesis, I really believe it's true, that this period of the Cold War was more or less, a period of very high level of internationalism, because there were all these propositions of kind of, structuring the world through ideas and values that were valid for all people. And you had this competition between these three international, what I call three internationalism, the liberal one, the communist and socialist, I mean, communist meaning really Communist Party, communist, and third world, in a certain way, internationalism, which comes later, but which also is very important. So when I worked on that, what I found is that, in fact, one of the main issues in this period is really the question of global inequality in the Cold War, in the international organization. Why? Because these people are really afraid. Of course, I mean, their main, as we know, I mean, people are always looking into the future with their with the past, with all their categories of the past, and what they fear the most is the war, is the Third World War, and they think that this Third World War would be is a danger because of the global inequality, and in particular, first thing, the inequality between Eastern and Western Europe. That's something which, of course, we forgot because we're looking at the difference between Eastern and Western Europe just in an ideological way, but there was also, of course, an economic inequality between both, and it was very important, and it was really something which has been discussed very early on in international organizations. So what I want to do is just, to go very quickly through the 3 steps of these books with the 3 periods, just, highlighting this question of global inequality. Of course, my book is not just about global inequality, but since, I have to choose, I choose this kind of perspective. So the first thing is, in fact, this whole discussion begins during the period of the war and the planning of the post-war with a kind of what I call pan-European project. Well, here it is. And during the war, and that knows this guy very well, Rosenstein-Rodan, who is a Polish economist, and what Rosenstein-Rodan during the war is already saying, and then, he will be hired by the World Bank, is that there is a kind of unequal development between Eastern and Western Europe. I mean, you can look at the quotation on the screen, and that, in fact, we have to find solutions for to fight this inequality between Eastern and Western Europe, and that this inequality, in a certain way, could then, the blueprint could be then applied for the world in general. So it's just, how international organizations work. Very often, they have the blueprint, and then they apply the blueprint for the whole world. So that's very important to think of this kind of this kind of unbalance of development between Eastern and Western Europe, because for me, it's the beginning of the book, the way you can look at the book. So, and in fact, this is taken up, this kind of this very important issue, the inequality of development of the global of the inequality within Europe. It's taken up by the Economic Commission for Europe, which is set up in 1947. Very good archives in Geneva. Not all international organizations have good archives, but this one has very good archives. And Gunnar Myrdal, who is the secretary, the secretary, yes, that's also something that you have to know about international organizations. It's very important to know all the details, because otherwise you're not, you cannot talk with these people. So it's a secretary and general secretaries as UNCTAD and so on. And all these things are very important for the people. So is a secretary, and Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish social democrat, is important. He's really making this point from the beginning that all Europe, both East and West, and between advanced and backward meaning, of course, underdeveloped, meaning Eastern Europe, meaning periphery in a certain way. The first periphery of Western Europe is Eastern Europe, had in fact to be improved in production, living standard, and that could be achieved. And the thing which I find very interesting in this quotation, that it says, and it will not be the old one, the balance that left the East in a semi-colonial state. So meaning that it applies the category of colonial and post-colonial to Europe itself. Of course, as we know, these Eastern European countries and Southeastern European countries are in fact coming from big empires. So it's interesting, because that's a discussion that now historians have about, can we look at this country as kind of post-colonial countries? But that's something which was already there in the quotation of Gunnar Myrdal. And he was not the only person, in fact, because Walter Rostow, I always show Walter Rostow when I'm in the US, because every US person has a certain representation of Walter Rostow. And Walter Rostow was not this guy in the 40s and the 50s. It was very different. And in the 40s and the 60s, and at Columbia, by the way, there is very good archives on Myrdal and all these people, Owen and all these people, and Rostow is so much pushing for development of Eastern Europe in this archive. It's just unbelievable. I couldn't believe, again, how really involved in this kind of trying to rebalance Europe, he was against the United States, in fact, because he said, I mean, it's important that that in Europe, people buy the Polish coal and not the US coal. It doesn't make any sense. So there is, all this issue, which I find very interesting. And he says, of course, that there is an important tranche of European economic interest between East and West. And these people were absolutely aware of the fact that even the communists were, seizing power in this country. It was important to continue dealing with it and to continue dealing with these countries. And if you look at the archives of the Economic Commission for Europe, in fact, you see that they're still talking to each other, even in 1952. I mean, really, the high time of Stalinism and so on and so forth. You still have Czech people and Polish people coming to Geneva and talking to the French, talking to the British, and so on and so forth. So that's something which, of course, you don't know if you don't look at these archives. But and it's important because they do good work. It's not just that they're talking to each other. They're doing things. They're really doing things. So okay, and they're doing things against the economic Cold War, which is at that time, also beginning in 1947, because part of the Marshall Plan is an economic Cold War against the East. I mean, that we have to be very clear about that. And also, of course, the COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Control, set up in 1949, which plays a very important role in fact, preventing Eastern European country to get some technology. And now these countries are looking at how much they lost by that. I mean, we know how much now there has been, this historiography about how Western European got from the Marshall Plan, but nobody has looked at how can I say that? How did the Marshall Plan deprive the East from resources? And that's something which is discussed now, I know, in Poland and other countries. So anyway, that's what I really want to point to. That's the second part, is that in fact, despite all this economic Cold War and so on and so forth, inside international organization, you have people who really want to keep these channels open between East and West, and in particular to try to develop the East. Really, it's very important for them. It's the way they're looking at things. And I was just trying to follow the people, because it's very important to know who are these people. And what I found out, of course, it's partial because it's very complicated to follow everybody, but it's partial. But there is one group which I find is very important in my story. That's certain social democrats, not all social democrats, but the social democrats which came from this international group of democratic socialists, which are these people have been resistance fighters in Stockholm, and among these people you have some of them who would be very important for my story, like Willy Brandt, Bruno Kreisky, Gunnar Myrdal, and others who met and other Malinowski and who were together in Stockholm, met in Stockholm. Owen also, they also met Owen in Stockholm. I mean, all these people who are very important for my story met in Stockholm, and this is a group of democratic socialists. And when you look at their archives, you see that they know each other very well, that they are really always in contact. That I just discovered in Colombia at the Rare Books and Manuscripts, and they are in constant contact with each other, and they meet as socialists, really as social democrats together in the international organization. So, and they act as bridge builder. Why? Because also they are in contact with their former socialist comrades or friends, as they say. Comrades is for communist friends, and these ones are now part of the Communist Party in the East because they didn't have the choice. But they're still, they're still the same kind of group of people. So they're still in contact with each other, and that helps building these bridges. Okay, so you have this Okay, that I skip, but it's also important to remember that the anti-fascism remains an important value in this international organization, something which has been completely, covered by the Cold War, but it's still a very important value in international organization. It's still, I mean, don't remember, I mean, the United Nations has been created during the war as a war alliance in 1942. And the people who joined the United Nations joined also the United Nations against fascism. It's very important for them. And so that's, also something which it was so unexpected for me. I looked at the archives of David Morse, which is a general director of this time is general director of the International Labour Office, a US person, very anti-communist. He goes to Czechoslovakia and to Poland, and he is greeted really very warmly because in particular Sharanshievich or even Novotny, who is really a Stalinist, because they are supposed to have met in Mauthausen. Certainly, they have never met in Mauthausen, but it's just a sign that here there are people who have fought against fascism together. And because Morse was part of the army, he engaged in the army to fight against fascism. And both of them were in Mauthausen, and Morse had liberated Mauthausen. And they knew that. So for them, it's something which, connects them, this fight against fascism in a certain way, even though certainly they never met in Mauthausen. But that's interesting that they make this story in order to be able, to have something in common. That's a very interesting thing. Maybe they met, I don't know, but there is no evidence that they met, and it doesn't matter at the end. What matters is that they just talked about it. So one place which is also important is Vienna as a bridge, and Vienna, of course, it's Kreisky. So we go back to this international socialist, and one of the organization which is really very unknown, but I find very important, is UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, in particular because, and that will talk to you, because Bulgaria was very active in UNIDO. Bulgaria was very active in UNIDO, and in particular, UNIDO was very influential in providing expertise for Bulgaria for the development of computers. There was a big industry of computer. I mean, Bulgaria was the Japan of the Comic-Con in a certain way, or the Silicon Valley of the Comic-Con. They provided most of the computers to the Comic-Con in the 60s, and in particular the 70s and the 80s. So, of course, they spied on certain countries. That's right, in particular on Japan. But they also got a lot of expertise directly from the UNIDO, who set up a research center for developing their computing expertise. So, there is a lot of things which just go through that. Okay, so now I just finish with the third part, which is the part from the east to the south. So you remember the blueprint of Rosenstein-Rodan in 1942. So this idea that, in fact, we have to develop the development in the kind of first periphery of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then we can apply it for the world. And that's what I found, in fact. I mean, in particular, I mean, when they do a program, in certain program, management program, social security program, I have a lot of examples in the books. Now, it's a little bit abstract, but in fact, I mean, there are really real examples. And then they apply this program. If it's successful, they ask the people, and again, Bulgaria is a very important, in-between country, to invite people from the global south, experts from the global south, to learn from what they've learned from the UN, very often from the West, Western experts to the UN. So, and Bulgaria is a very good model, for example, in agriculture, which I find so unbelievable because agriculture is just a failure of socialism, and they don't know. So they put, their expert to Bulgaria just to develop a kind of a cooperative mission and so on and so forth. And then they said, now, Bulgaria can teach the East, the Middle East, how to do that and so on. And Bulgaria, if you go to Bulgaria in that time, I mean, agriculture is just a failure. And they didn't know. They just apply, this kind of blueprint, which is something that that is really interesting. And I'm reading to the sources. So, but of course, you know, in a certain way, it would be forced to see the East as just, you know, trying to get out of underdevelopment, because it's the way some of the countries see themselves, really, and helping the globe, what we now call the global South, what was called in that time the Third World, out of this underdevelopment. In fact, it's not entirely true. And when the United Nations Conference for Commerce and Trade was created in 1964, the socialist countries were part of it, but they were not really very supportive of what was happening there, because as a GDR guy, a GDR expert, I shouldn't say guy, a GDR expert was saying, and that I found in the Stasi archives, I mean, in fact, we're not exactly on the same path. I mean, in fact, it's not exactly, we don't really have the same aim. So in a way, it's interesting to see how this kind of underdevelopment situation can create links between Eastern Europe and the Third World, but there are a lot of limits to that, and it's very important to remember that. So now, the thing which is important is that the international organization were part for the organization. I'm finishing now. The only thing, yeah, it's always too long. I'm so sorry. But it's a book I've taken 10 years to write. So I mean, you know. Okay, so okay, maybe I finish now. No, okay, no, I just want to finish with one thing. Of course, everybody knows about, maybe not everybody knows about the new international economic order, but, you know, there was this idea put in 1974 of the new international economic order. And that was interesting for me because, of course, you know, the Western left and also the Eastern European countries, the way they were positioning themselves in front of this proposition of new international economic order, which was proposed by the third world countries, was complicated. In particular, of course, there were things that the communist parties were agreeing with, like nationalization of multinational corporation, but there were things with which they couldn't agree, which was, for example, giving a certain percentage of their GDP for development of the third world countries. And the thing which I find interesting is that in a certain way, because there was this kind of dissonance, I would say, or disagreement between both, I mean, then you see again how some socialists, not all of them, some socialists just jump into that, and also with certain Cold War issues in their head. And that's, I would say, the last occurrence of really engagement in favor of more equal world. And it's a Brand Commission report of 1980, in fact, you know, 80, 81, 82, 80, excuse me. And that you see the Brand report because it's one of the first time that you see this divide between global North and global South. And this divide between global North and global South is really, you know, this idea that there is this inequality and we have in a certain way to fight, to find a solution against this inequality. And in particular, I mean, what is proposed is taxes on armament, better regulation of global trade, but of course, and that's a difference with the communists, no question of nationalization of multinational corporations. So that's the main difference. And then, okay, so we know, because it's not the world we live in, that it has been a failure. And I can talk about that. It's one entire chapter of my book, but I won't go into that, just Cancun, because such an ideal place where, in fact, the Brand report was buried. So, and that's really, and of course, you have the usual suspects, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, but they're not the only one. You have also a lot of what I say, I mean, the very well organized employers organization that you see lobbying international organizations. They're very good at doing that, very, very good. In particular, the Christian one, I have to say, UNIAPAC, just unbelievable. So, so just to finish, I don't want to be too optimistic. I don't want to exalt the kind of regulatory power of international organization or to praise excessively the advantage of UN multinationalism. It's not what I want to do. I just want to show that if you look closely inside what these international organizations are doing, you can find a kind of alternative history. And this alternative history has also to be taught. That's the only thing I want to say. Okay. Thank you. So much looking forward to your comments.
A World More Equal offers a history of the 4 decades after 1945 through the prism of international organizations and various discourses and ideologies of internationalism. The book is strongest and very strong on the relations between the first and second worlds, or rather, if we want to escape a Cold War vocabulary, the US and Western Europe on the one hand and Eastern Europe on the other. Sandrine is certainly right that the debates carried on in the secretariats and commissions, ranging from UNESCO, the World Health Organization, ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Commission, to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and UNIDO, about which she talked extensively. These have been neglected. She deftly uncovers multiple international exchanges that occurred within international organizations across Cold War boundaries in Europe and explores the kinds of epistemic communities and knowledge production that occurred within them. Participants shared, she argues, and I quote, a belief in modernity as well as the objectives of economic and social progress, end quote. But of course, they did not necessarily define these in the same economic and political terms. And more unpacking of the concept of modernity would have been helpful. The book offers a rich discussion of the emergence of 3 internationalisms in the 1950s and 1960s. A US liberal anti-communist one, noted, it seems to me, as much for that which it attacked its negative aspects as its positive ones, a communist internationalism, and a third way internationalism for which Yugoslavia was singled out as the model. And here one wishes a bit more attention had been paid to the third world origins of this non-aligned internationalism. The chapter on the NIEO is very well done, the New International Economic Order, but it covers ground that at least is pretty well known in this country because there's been a proliferation of English language works in the last few years about that. But the discussion of détente, it seems to me, breaks new ground in showing the important role of international organizations in paving the way for the Helsinki Accord and for implementing them. Sandrine's book is a welcome contribution to recent studies that are reevaluating the League of Nations and the United Nations, and that make international organizations, and not just nation states, important global actors and not merely platforms on which nation states interacted. It turns our attention to aspects of the neglected history of social and economic rights as a way to tackle inequality, whereas earlier most attention was paid only to political and legal ones. It contributes as well to a growing body of work that has explored the permeability of the Iron Curtain, the multiple interactions of Eastern and Western European states and peoples, and the often autonomous actions taken not only by smaller Western European countries, but also by communist Eastern European ones. It is so good that this important work is available in English translation. Having praised your important work, I do want to raise a few questions, however.
Of course, I'm expecting that.
A World More Equal successfully reconstructs of a variety of internationalism, especially in UN organizations, which were committed, as she says, to working toward a more progressive and equal world, and which spoke the language of social and economic rights. As an historian of 20th century Europe, I found the discussion of groups like the UN Economic Commission for Europe particularly informative. I had come across the Myrdal report, but didn't know much else about this group, and certainly not its afterlife. The UN Economic Commission on Europe both advocated for reconnecting East and Western Europe economically and thereby developing the East, And it, during the 70s, encouraged trade and exchange of all sorts between Eastern and Western Europe in the period of détente and the Helsinki Accords. But I wanted to know more about what they did and did not accomplish. It seems to me that the efforts to knit together Eastern and Western Europe failed quite miserably due to U.S. opposition and the threat to deny Marshall Plan aid to any state which traded goods to countries in Eastern Europe, goods which stood on this coordinating committee or COCOM list of prohibited items, which was well over 50% of all items that could possibly have been traded.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the international organizations were somewhat more successful in encouraging and actually implementing some exchanges, and you talked about computers to Bulgaria and other things, during the 1970s. But I'd like to know, and exchanges and trade did increase then, but I'd like to know the relative importance of these organizations versus both Western European nation states and corporations in Western Europe, which were very interested in getting a foothold and more in the East. The US was not a part of those increased exchanges. For other UN organizations, and I know, this is asking you to write a book even longer, but one wonders how the extent to which organizations like the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the World Health Organization, what were their projects for a more equal work? And did they meet the kind of multiple obstacles that groups like the Economic Commission on Europe met in the 1950s? In short, it's important.
FAO archives are not available. They're in Rome, and they're very difficult to. That's the reason why it's not in the book.
Okay, I mean, I understand the difficulty of seeing how one moves from this level of very interesting, discourse and knowledge production to seeing what kind of actual projects and social practices they could transform. They could implement on the ground, and then to assess whether, in fact, these did make the world more equal or had more contradictory and ambivalent respects, not only vis-a-vis Eastern Europe, but above all, the Third World. What I liked as someone who has worked on the question of social and economic human rights is that A World More Equal shows the centrality of talking about economic and social rights in a variety of international organizations, both after 1945 in UNESCO and ECOSOC and the ILO, and then in the 1970s, above all, UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. They did discursively take very seriously economic and social rights that were integral to the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that are all too often overlooked. When I started developing a course on the history of human rights many years ago, I actually read the Universal Declaration for the first time, and I was stunned by all these social and economic rights, which feature very prominently, sometimes a little problematically, but they're really there. And the way the Declaration was discussed in the US and in part in Western Europe was only in terms of political and civil rights. But did economic and social rights ever stand a chance of getting seriously on the agenda of international organizations and into the policies and practices of the most powerful states? I think probably only to a limited degree. One of the things in the work that I've done on social and economic human rights that struck me is they're always getting raised on the agenda and then pushed off of the agenda. The separation of human rights into two covenants, political and civil on the one hand, and social, economic, and cultural in the early 1950s. This separation, it seems to me, really contributed to the marginalization of economic, social, and cultural rights. The separation enabled the US to ratify the political and civil covenant, although it only did so in 1992, very late, but not to ratify the social and economic covenant. The U.S. has never ratified the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, along with a handful of other countries such as Iran, Sudan, Somalia, and Palau. The U.S. led the international opposition to the new international economic order and contributed almost immediately to making it a dead letter after the General Assembly passed it. The U.S. has opposed strenuously the 1986 Declaration of the Right to Development, which is still kicking around the UN in the Human Rights Commission, but has not in any way been substantially implemented. The reasons for U.S. opposition to social and economic rights and the greater equality they might bring have been multiple: anti-communism, anti-totalitarianism, defense of U.S. sovereignty, religious and cultural objections. The U.S. insists rights are individual and not collective. The political and legal rights are not inextricably intertwined with economic and social ones, that social protections and economic development are not rights, but rather aspirations, and that developed countries cannot be held legally responsible for aiding less developed ones, which is one of the things that's in this Declaration of the Right to Development. I could give more examples, but the point I want to make is that the U.S., much more, I think, than Western Europe, was the key player in defeating the visions of international organizations that sought to make the world more equal. Here is where the Cold War did profoundly shape and weaken international organizations. The various UN secretariats and commissions might well have members who tried to ignore ideology, but the US never did. You were, it seems to me, perhaps too uncritical and too gentle to the US and its role in marginalizing the measures for greater inequality. The last chapter of A World More Equal, entitled From Internationalism to Globalism, explores how neoliberalism triumphed in the West and after 1989 in Eastern Europe, and the world became ever less equal. With evocative anecdotes and statistics, Sandrine traces the erosion and collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the sidelining of any variety of third world internationalism in the wake of the effective defeat of the NIEO in the late 70s. What I missed in that chapter was any in-depth investigation of what was happening inside the international organizations themselves, especially UN ones, which featured so prominently in earlier chapters. It was not just that organizations like UNCTAD and EU development organizations were marginalized. They too came gradually to endorse the neoliberal consensus and accept the need for structural adjustment policies in return for loans that trap so many countries in the global South. In an endless cycle of debt and underdevelopment. Did the personnel of these organizations change in the 70s and 80s? What happened to that social democratic anti-fascist generation that you see as playing such a prominent role in the 50s and 60s? Or did the same personnel change their views of economic and social rights and the kind of global economy that they wanted? Did they become neoliberal globalists from conviction or resigned there is no alternative? These are questions I had hoped you would explore. And I think we still need for international organizations the kind of study that Stephanie Mudge did for national economic thinkers and politicians in her brilliant book, Leftism Reinvented: Western Parties from Socialism to Neoliberalism. The final point I want to raise is about the overall framing of the book. I think in the written version, more than in what you said, you sort of argue this is an alternative history of the years from 45 to the 80s, one that challenges the Cold War centrality to a variety of discourses, policies, and conflicts, and creates new origin stories outside of Cold War framing. I guess I'm not sure how fruitful it is to ask the sort of which came first and which is more important question. You know, was it the Cold War or discourses about economic and social rights, the Cold War or decolonization? It seems to me that's impossible to think one without the other. The Cold War wasn't responsible for everything that happened in the 4 decades of its classic phase, but the Cold War shaped and warped everything that occurred there. And these included the three varieties of internationalism, whose histories are at the heart of your book. The challenge is to explore the myriad and shifting interconnections and mutual influences among them, which I think you do in much of the body of it, but in the overall framing, it sort of gets back to a kind of Cold War binary thinking that, yeah. But anyway, it's a really important book, and I'm glad to have had a chance to engage with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. I will, following third, I'll try to keep my comments to the allotted 10 minutes. And I just want to say that this book was a real pleasure for me to read on a personal level, because as a very young woman, I spent a lot of time doing Model United Nations. I started doing Model UN when I was 13, and I continued all the way up to university. And so much of what Model United Nations is these personal relationships that you develop when you're caucusing and you're learning how to write a resolution, Freudian slip, when you're trying to figure out how to get an amendment passed. And so much of this book is, as an ethnographer and not a historian, I was really impressed at the level of personal relationships. You mentioned it here in your presentation, the fact that so many of these people knew each other from the anti-fascist struggle, and they really identified as socialists, as social democrats, and they kept those connections and those friendships, and I would even say comradeships, alive, right? Even though Europe was being increasingly divided, and there were really high stakes for maintaining those kinds of personal relationships with people. That there's a moment there are many moments in this book where there's a very human story to be told, right? So it's not about the organizations. We hear about these organizations, and the UN is so good with all these acronyms, right? But in these organizations are actual people. And they're just not only diplomats, but international civil servants, and they interact, they talk, they share a worldview, and they actually feel remarkably and uniquely empowered to make the world a better place. They think they can do it. I mean, from our perspective in 2023, that seems so catastrophically naive that to read about it, especially, in this moment that we find ourselves in right now, to read about a group of people empowered by their experiences of the war, their shared experiences of anti-fascism, their commitment to these organizations and to a particular vision of a world more equal, very specifically, as Sandrine said, to prevent World War III, right? There was a real fear that if there's going to be another war, it's going to be a bad one. So we should do everything possible to address these deep and profound inequalities, these legacies of colonialism and post-colonialism that are creating instability in the world. So I see this book very much in conversation with Theodora Dragostinova's recent book, Cold War from the Margins in 2021, which is showing what the Cold War looked like from Bulgaria, from the Bulgarian perspective, and international global cultural diplomacy in the 80s. James Mark has also recently written, co-edited a couple of books called Socialism Goes Global, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe in the Age of Decolonization, and Alternative Globalizations, Eastern Europe and the Post-Colonial World, really looking at Yugoslavia and the role that Yugoslavia played. And in this book, there's also this, again, music to my ears, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, this involvement, these marginal countries that we don't really think about anymore were really important during the Cold War. They were doing really important things, and they were bridging these divisions between what was then called the first, the second, and the third world. So I think, one of the things that for me specifically, I was really taken in by the chapters about the new international economic order and the ways in which these alliances between socialists and social democrats in Eastern and Western Europe then allow for these transfers of technology, and then how that gets filtered into the global South or the third world. And the ways in which you argue and others have argued that it really benefited, right? These countries in the South, in the global South, and also the way that the countries in the global South then also forged allegiances with particular people in the Eastern Bloc who then felt really empowered because they really believed as socialists, even though their own countries weren't working, and many of them were quite critical of what was called at the time really existing socialism. They believed in the possibility of socialism with a human face, right? And so much of this is about socialism with a human face.
Absolutely.
Right?
Thank you.
And so, and what does that mean, socialism with a human face? And for me, as somebody who's, I've worked in the archives in Bulgaria, I've worked in the archives of Zambia, looking at these international connections between ministries of foreign affairs, between women's groups, between different state actors, but I also spoke to people. I did oral histories. And many of these people were octogenarians and nonagenarians who have real memories of the solidarity that they felt. And so I can, give you a couple of really concrete examples of and so much of this book recuperates this story of collaboration and solidarity and comradeship. And I'm not looking at this uncritically. I think it's very important to understand that there were still hierarchies of power and influence and inequality and racism and classism and sexism that still pervaded these networks. But nevertheless, there was a real sense of connection. So for the 1980, the Second World Conference on Women, the UN Conference on Women in Copenhagen, the Eastern Bloc countries wanted to create a kind of bloc of socialist progressive women. And of course, many women from the global South, particularly in Africa, could not afford to fly to Copenhagen. Copenhagen is a really expensive country. Denmark is a very expensive country. Copenhagen is a very expensive city. So what they did was the Czechoslovaks flew all of the African delegates to Prague on free tickets. And then they had a little conference in Prague. That was the cover for this, was that they had a conference in Prague where they basically talked a little bit about UN procedures. UN procedures, by the way, are incredibly arcane and frustrating. And it's very difficult to work at the UN if you don't know these really weird rules, right? So teaching people about rules, working within committees, which committees you're on, ECOSOC, Security Council, First Committee, Second Committee, all these different things. And then the Czechs, together with the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was based in East Berlin at the time, and the Bulgarian Women's Committee played a big part on this, they contacted the women's section of the Danish Communist Party. And they
Communist party. Very small.
Very small, but enough to host the entire delegation in homestays because they couldn't afford hotels. So they flew all together from Prague to Copenhagen, and then in Copenhagen, all of the delegates were housed with women, families from the Danish Communist Party, right? So this shows you the blurring of the boundaries of the Cold War. I think so often we have this very, very rigid idea of the Iron Curtain, especially I think coming from the United States, but it was absolutely porous. And this book so brilliantly shows how porous that was. I can think of lots of wonderful examples of this kind of collaboration between the East and the South. And I think that it's a really important story that is not told, and it needs to be told more often and more forcefully. Again, while recognizing the very unequal nature of some of these relationships, there was a way in which countries like Bulgaria and Yugoslavia build themselves very openly as post-colonial. They said, we too were colonized. We too had these imperial overlords for 500 years. And we got free, and now we're trying to become modern. And there is an interesting question about socialist modernity versus capitalist modernity that is in the literature right now. And people are debating, is it an alternate modernity? Is the same modernity? There's an interesting conversation that I think this book speaks very directly to. But because Yugoslavia and Bulgaria were kind of marginal to Europe, let's face it, they still kind of are marginal to Europe. They were able to turn to countries in the global South and say, hey, we too were marginalized. We too have had the experience of colonialism. And so let us help you. And that's where this technical assistance, even though, as I think you quite point out, it wasn't necessarily working very well in Yugoslavia or Bulgaria in all cases, but in some ways it was, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe agriculture was not such a great thing,
No.
but certainly when it came to building kindergartens and creches
and computers.
and computers,
Wow.
kindergartens, creches, but and also there were a lot of tractors that made it to
Yeah.
places like Zambia from
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, right? They may not have been the best tractors, but they were cheap tractors.
Yeah.
And when I was working in the archives in Zambia, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I saw a lot of debates within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for these technical assistance agreements. And the Zambians would say, okay, well, the Americans will give us better tractors, but they're more expensive, and then we'll have to service them with American parts. And they're going to give us a loan, but it's at this rate, this interest rate, and it's in this term. And then you would read the Soviet tractors or the Czech tractors or the Bulgarian tractors, and they would say, okay, well, we'll get these Bulgarian tractors. They're probably not as good. They'll break down, but they'll service them for free, and they'll send us the parts as part of a solidarity agreement. So there was a way in which if you just needed tractors, you had to make a choice, right? And that kind of tension, especially for countries that were nominally non-aligned, like Zambia was, there was always this kind of negotiation that was going on behind the scenes. So the other thing that I think is so important about this book is that it so profoundly challenges the narrative of Western triumphalism after the Cold War is over in 89 or 91. And there's this wonderful section towards the end of the book, from internationalisms to globalism, where you really push back and say, no, Reagan did not end the Cold War. There was so much else going on. And you say very clearly, the citizens of countries in the bloc, the Eastern Bloc, produced quite early on a language of human rights by drawing inspiration from the letter of socialism, as well as the commitments made by the governments of their countries. Their demands were transformed into an international cause through a confluence of movements and initiatives that attest to the eclectic diffusion of human rights rhetoric. This rhetoric was appropriated by the usual actors of Cold War anti-communism, the Ford Foundation, the AFL-CIO, the CIA, and the Catholic Church. But it was also mobilized by new groups structured around demands for self-management and protection of individual rights. And that is a story that is so important. And I think that it speaks to a tension that we're having right now. I think that this way in which the last 30 years of the Cold War has been, post-Cold War period has been told as one of sort of like the West won, the East lost, has reinscribed this sort of weird colonial relationship in Eastern Europe. So that you have, in many places, this incredible nostalgia for Eastern European state socialism that manifests itself not only among older generations, but increasingly among younger generations, people born after 89 and 1991. I was just on a panel at the the ACES conference. It used to be called the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. Now it's the American Slavic East European Studies and Eurasian Association, or whatever it's called. They keep, we have to like be careful with names these days, and there's no Russian in there, so that's good. But there is two things happened. This was just last week in Philadelphia. The first is that there's a new Yugoslavia group, which are a bunch of people, mostly under the age of 35, from all of the former republics of Yugoslavia, who are getting together and they're reimagining Yugoslavia as a social, political, and intellectual project, the history of this country and the promise of what it stood for. They had a big party, and it was exactly what I imagine these international organizations are, what they're so good at doing. If you go to the archives, there are often pictures of the receptions and the parties and the colloquia, right? The ways in which people interact with each other in person, in real time, talking, sharing ideas. That was exactly what was happening. And then the very next night, that was Friday night, the very next night on Saturday night, there was this thing. Was anybody at ACES last week? No. Yes.
Socialism and barbarism.
Exactly. I was just going to say the new Black Sheep Collective, right? which I think is an interesting, they brought, as far as I understood, 85 people to that conference to have a series of panels called Socialism or Barbarism. So there's this really interesting way in which the ideals of internationalism that you are talking about in this book are a place of renewed interest. And you ended your comments here by saying that you didn't want to be too optimistic, that you didn't want to be too uncritical. And yet I think of this, at least maybe I'm reading it with a particular set of eyes in a particular moment, but I think of this as a really hopeful book because it's an alternative history. And it's important because it excavates the possibility of a world more equal. It shows us the structures, the frameworks, the discourses of how this might have occurred. It gives us a glimpse of why it didn't occur, how it was challenged, the role particularly, I think, of the United States. And I agree with you here that there could have been more of unpacking of the United States and the United Kingdom as like the bulwarks against the world more equal. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, it's still a story of an alternate possibility. It's a story of a different vision. And it didn't work, but that doesn't mean that it will never work. And for me, that is a hopeful message. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Since it's late, maybe I just know I don't answer the question because it's late. I will answer your question by answering the other question because I want really to give the other possibility of asking.
I'll keep a list of questions as we go. I'll ask you to please introduce yourselves when actually asking a question. Charlie, is that you?
Thank you for the great talk. Can you hear me okay over there?
Please introduce yourself and a little louder.
I'm Charlie. I'm a PhD student in media studies.
Stand up because I cannot hear you.
I'm Charlie. I'm a PhD student here in media studies. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Well, thanks for the great talk. Congratulations on the book. I was wondering if you could speak more about your three categories, the liberal internationalism, the communist, and the third world, and where you situate the kind of anti-fascist social democrats. I assume that's in the first camp. And then I was also wondering if you could talk about within this group of the anti-fascist social democrats, a certain resistance also to too much equality as also a potential cause of war. Specifically, I'm thinking around things like expropriation, the Brandt Commission's opposition to that, and how things like investor-state arbitration also arise out of this kind of anti-fascist ethos, but then become a very anti-egalitarian national politics. Are those clear questions?
Larry?
Oh, this is wonderful. Hi, I'm Larry McGrath. I direct research for Amazon Prime Video. I thought that your interest in these civil servants really stood through. Much of the discussion is focused on our categories of historical analysis and trying to traverse them. I'm wondering how you would see civil servants as part of the audience, as readers of this book, and what you would want them to take home from it.
Okay, so first of all, thank you both of you so much for your remarks, comments, and the way it's always very interesting to look to listen to what people make out of your book, because of course there's a kind of reappropriation which is different from what you wanted to do, and part of it is okay, but part of it is different, and it makes you think. That's how I changed the title of my book, in fact. Because, there were people telling, okay, so it's really about global inequality. And I said, yes, this person is right. It wasn't. So, it's very, that's why I like kind of intellectual discussion is so important. So anyway, and of course, books are always unfinished. So what you say about the US, yes, you're right. I could have put more of the US. But I was not so much interested in that. I have to say, I was more interested in the resistance of the employers, for example. because I was looking at the ILO and I was looking how they organize and so on and so forth. And this is a story which is really not told. Now I'm working on multinational corporation, and these people are very well organized, but they are completely invisible. Completely invisible. They never come to international organization with a flag and saying, hey, we are blocking that, we are blocking that. No, they're just, going into them, into the committees and so on and so forth, and in particular through the US, of course. And the US Chamber of Commerce is very powerful. So, but when you say the US, what do you think? Who are the actors in the US? Is it the US government? Is it the US employer? US is a very complicated democracy. So when of course, when you speak about the GDR, it's easier because, but when you speak about the US and these actors, and in particular the employers, which are absolutely not visible. They're not visible. Capital is not visible in the US. But as I tell and it's one of the answer to your civil servant, when I talk to the UN right now, and I look at the UNCTAD, for example, because UNCTAD is still existing, and you look at their website, it's just so devastating. Really, when you think of what they were supposed to do and what they're doing now, corporate social responsibility, the thing which give no rights to anybody. And I say, what the UN has become is more or less a kind of backward of a kind of le jardin des employeurs, I say. A kind of backyard of the employers, and it's exactly that. It's exactly that. So just focusing on countries, I admit I could have focused more on the US, but focusing on countries is not enough. You have to focus on economic interests, and they are very important. Very, very important. So, and that's why I decided to focus more on economic interest and less on the US. Maybe I should have focused more, but you cannot do everything. So I made my choice. So I know. The categories. Very good, Charlie. I'm very happy that you asked this question. Yes, where did I put the Social Democrat? Yeah, it's also an answer to your question about liberal internationalism. I don't reduce liberal internationalism to anti-communism. Anti-communism is a kind of subcategory of liberal. And by the way, there are a lot of non-liberal into this anti-communist, like for example, the Catholic Church and so on and so forth. But the Social Democrats belong, of course, to the liberals. They are absolutely liberal. And these anti-fascists are liberals. They are liberals. Most of them are liberals. So, this liberal internationalism is something which I deem progressive. I don't deem I deem absolutely progressive. Look at Myrdal, for example. Myrdal is a real liberal. He is a liberal. All these social democrats are liberal. So I completely agree with you. It's and they are liberal, but they are belonging to this, I would say, good tradition of liberalism. It's a 19th century tradition of liberalism, which is really trying to organize a balance between labor and capital. And there are these people. Look at, in particular, in 19th century Germany, look at Max Weber and look at the others. These people were liberal, but they were completely aware that you have to build a society. And in order to build a society, you have to build a kind of more balanced society between, agreement between labor and capital. And that's something which exists. And because we are always thinking of liberal, I'm not talking about liberal the way it is used in this country, liberal like left. But in Europe, because most of the people would think that as liberal as what we now call, and it's very blurred, it's completely very complicated definition, as neoliberal, we forget about, this kind of very progressive liberalism, which did exist and still exists in this international organization. And just to finish about your question about the 70s, you're right. Of course, it's a generational process. All these people disappeared because they were old. So they left the UN, and this kind of generation of anti-fascists, it just left. And then if you look at the people who enter, they are very different. Also because they don't have, this kind of idea that we have to prevent the third world and so on, the third war and so on and so forth, This is a new generation of people. They are bureaucrats, they are very different. They come from very different schools. They are coming from schools, by the way. The others are not coming from schools. They are coming from schools, in particular, we know, where they are recruited, Harvard and all this, they are business school or political science and so on. These other people come not from this background. They were very different. But of course, there is no real prosopography of the UN Secretariat because it's too big. So it's very complicated. You have to select and so on and so forth. But I have one graduate student who did that just for women. And it's very clear that there is a change in generation. So you're absolutely right. Inside the UN, things are changing. Inside the international organization, things are changing. About the civil servant. Yeah, of course, I know. I know not all of them, of course. I know a lot of civil servants in international organizations. I live in Geneva for part of the year, so and Geneva is a small city, so you meet them all the time. And when I go to the ILO archives, I meet them all the time, so on and so forth. So, first of all, just a completely personal story. When I began living in Geneva, I said, oh my God, that's exactly the city for me because it will be a cosmopolitan city. And when I go to the UN, when I go to the International Labour Organization, that's when I can meet, the world. Not me the world, the international organization. These people are experts. They're expert in certain, and they can be very good experts, by the way. But they're expert of certain topics. And they talk to each other on the basis of this expertise, more now only in English, which is also a problem because some are, of course, they have, in particular, the British, because they speak a very, very high-level English. No, but it's a real problem because I have one of my person I know in the ILO who says, now I want to make myself understandable. He's British. So I begin with my 300 words English. So, the language is a real issue now in international organization. So, and that's why they are confined in a certain way to expertise, because in this expertise, they can communicate with each other. But on this kind of very general discussion, the discussion is becoming very complicated because of the language issue. It's the way I see it. So for example, when you go to the, it's very interesting when you go to the restaurant, they have all, everybody, each organization has a restaurant. When you go to the restaurant, people are so tired of speaking English the whole day that they're talking to, they go together, eat together by language. The Germans are eating together, the Spaniards are eating together, the people speaking Spanish are going, the Japanese are eating together. They don't want to speak English anymore. They want to speak together in their own language. And the language is very important.
One more question. So, Angela, and then why don't we take these two, and then I have Theo and then we'll close it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Angelo Coyote. I'm assistant professor at Barnard College and currently a fellow here. Thank you so much for the great presentation. I have a question about how they're thinking about equality and inequality in your story. And in particular, since you mentioned the very strong anti-fascist sort of ethos and spirit, I wonder if intellectually there's any connection or any distance from the way of thinking of inequality of people like Ghodsee, that obviously was a very prominent fascist statistician and demographer, and his coefficient still used to classify inequality. So I was wondering if there is a different way of thinking about inequality that they are producing, that they're thinking about, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you, all three of you. I have two questions at different levels. One is that, I was very intrigued by this discussion of this international civil servant class. And because, on a very personal level, as the mother and mother-in-law of two women who work in global NGOs, I'm thinking about the ways in which that kind of sensibility and also that sense of possibility, even though everything seems so catastrophic, has transferred to this other group of, global NGO people who constitute a truly global community, and they are extremely diverse in terms of where they come from, the global South, Europe, the United States, but they all in some way do speak the same language. And they do move around and they do hang out, whether they're in Kigali or they're in Bogota, they hang out in the same cafes and they have a lot of parties. And there is always that question of, well, what are we really doing? And the buzzword, as far as I can tell, only through my, generational transmission, is now, is decolonizing. So how do we decolonize these NGOs, which to some degree, it seems to mean, well, never, yeah. So I'm curious whether you see a kind of through line, both in terms of the sense of possibility still, and also, the very real problems. Is there a lesson we can learn from what you've done for these mostly young, mostly very, very elite, but extremely diverse people? So that was the one question on that, which I'm just sort of fascinated with. And the other, I'm actually looking at, so Malgosia knows about this, but whether it does seem that this axis of east to south was, I learned about this from you, it was extremely important, and not just in terms of Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, but also, Poland, like, Poland to India or the Soviet Union to India, and the ways in which, like, one sometimes gets the sense that for these Eastern European or even Soviet global civil servants, it was also a way of escaping, right? It was, they could go live in India or they could go live in some African country. So they represented this socialism with a human face, as even though their employers are becoming increasingly Stalinized, and they survived by mostly being outside of the country, and how that kind of plays in. So I guess it's also a lot about this question that you really raised of sort of the person, the human actors in this story. I just wanted to know more. I guess after different time.
Okay, so the definition of equality, inequality. So that's a good question, and in particular because you mentioned Gini and the fascist and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, in my book I don't speak about that, but I've studied that. I mean, the kind of fascist internationalism, which is also very important, and and they are able, of course, to elaborate their own definition of equality, inequality, and so on. And in the definition of inequality, there is also a racist dimension of inequality, which of course doesn't exist in this international, or not openly at least, exists in this international organization. Yeah, I mean, I would, that's always a problem with definition. International organization, most of the time, they don't give definitions, these people. I mean, they have their kind of own intuition of what equality should be, or more equality should be, or less inequality should be. But I mean, there is no standard definition of equality or inequality in international organization, even in the International Labour Organization, which is really addressing this question constantly. And that you have absolutely, and again, you don't have also a definition of social justice in the International Labour Organization. They don't give a definition. They give the solution. They give the way to try to address this question, but they never give a definition of the issue. And that's how international organizations are working. They are experts. They try to, I mean, in the secretariats, I'm not talking about the General Assemblies, of course, but they are experts, and they try to find solutions to address problems that they don't really define. So that's why it's a good question, because it just gives me the opportunity to tell you that, which is very important. Okay, and East South, yeah, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, you mentioned that. I mean, James Marx had group of, he had with other people, he's not the only one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a lot of people also in Leipzig in particular who have done very much work on this relationship between East and South. I'm thinking of, anyway, so these people have done very, very nice work at looking at this kind of relationship. So, I mean, they are also in my book, but through the eyes of international organizations, they've done that really directly. And also you've done that with Bulgaria and Zambia and other countries. So it's an expanding field of research, and I'm just a little part of it in a certain way. The way historians are working, we're working with each other in a certain way without knowing, but we're just bringing some more knowledge to a kind of collective knowledge. About the NGOs and the problem of decolonization, it's a very good question, because there is something about international organization, and it's what I was mentioning when I was talking about Bulgaria and the way they are taking, this kind of solution, and it just brings them to the global South. In that period, and maybe it is changing now, I don't know, but I have the feeling it's not changing very quickly. I mean, they elaborate solutions to certain problems. There are a lot of solutions to a lot of problems because they're facing with so many problems. And then, they are trying to implement this solution more or less in the same ways in various spaces. And that's a problem. Of course, you cannot do that. So I know that now more NGOs in particular are trying to find bottom-up solutions, trying to decolonize in particular by finding bottom-up solutions. And it's not that easy. So it's really a question that international civil servants, because they are intelligent people, are really struggling with. And they are discussing that all the time. It's a real issue.
I was wondering if there wasn't something about the way that you presented earlier in which you implied something about the presence of a kind of decolonizing thinking that's always already there. It just doesn't have that name.
Yeah.
That's not the priority. It's not the practice of it doesn't have to be called that in order for it to be that. And it has to be the kind of the inequality remains the priority as opposed to the political angle. I thought that was coming out more from the discussion.
Yeah.
But wasn't it, I mean, in the book, you seem to be saying the attitude was that particularly, the socialist countries, the second world, had a similar experience to the third, and they would teach them, never that there could be a kind of mutual teaching.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at the Secretariat in particular, because they're not dividing the world along ideological lines, but along really development lines. So they think that since Bulgaria and Yugoslavia are less developed, then they know better about the Middle East, for example. And then they could, and they create, this kind of new international spaces with Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and the Middle East together. And for them, it's not an issue, even if the regimes are different, because the logic is the logic of inequality, the logic of development, and so on and so forth. Now, about decolonization, it's very interesting.
Also post-Ottoman space.
Yeah, also, absolutely. It's also something I refer to, as this kind of, they have very clearly in mind this post-imperial spaces. That's very clear for them, and in particular, the post-Ottoman, absolutely. Now about decolonization, I mean, it depends what you mean with decolonization. I mean, the way we see decolonization now, it's exactly the way Atina was mentioning. Okay, so we're implying a kind of framework, intellectual framework to countries which are different, and then we're recolonizing them in a certain way. So we have to decolonize our discourse. It's not their problem in that period. Their problem is decolonization, meaning economic power, more or less. That the West is dominating economically the East and economically the global South, and that is what they mean with colonization. And decolonization meaning that we have to prevent the West to be so economically powerful on the less developed country. It's what they mean. So it's a different way of defining what decolonization or colonization
that's
is.
very helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Theo, and then behind you, Mr. Last two questions.
Theo Chino, acting secretary of the Social Democrat of America. And listening to you, suddenly I wanted to know if in your book, because it seems like your book talks about the social democracy movement, and there is a lack of the past of part of American. And my question was, I feel like as an American, there is a disconnect between the elite and the people, the working people. Idea don't flow very easily. In France, as an activist, I had the ability to meet elite. I was talking to the French UN ambassador. I talked to him. And in America, impossible. And it seems like within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, there is a vacuum that is very hard to transperse. So I was wondering if you talk about in your book, about when did the American disconnect between the elite and the working class took place? Or is that something that is not even?
It's a very good question, but I don't talk about that in the book because it's not part of my narrative in a certain way. But of course, it would be something that worth to discuss. Why is it different in France and in the US?
Because the international workers are considered elite, like all those.
Yeah, but there is something I can answer because it's interesting. Because I have been looking at the trade union, and recently I've been in Amsterdam looking at the International Confederation of Free Trade Union and also the communist one in Prague, the archives. And it's interesting how the people who are really the activists on the ground are looking at the people who are in international organizations like JUO in France, or for example, as traitors. Really, they look at them as traitors, are people who are, having a good life, in Geneva or whatever, and they are not really representing them. So the kind of grassroots internationalism, we are, and I'm looking at that right now because, you have to organize at a certain point. They wanted to organize the workers against multinational corporations. So how do you do that? How do you organize internationally workers on specific issues? It's difficult because exactly you have this disconnection. So then the International Trade Secretariat are doing a little bit better, but
Thank you. My name is Sandrine Kott. I'm a critical scholar at the Tourism Center. I'm working on the history of the legal Red Cross during the.
okay. Yeah.
And I have this general question about your opinion. What happened after? Like we are 30 years away from the Cold War. It's almost the same period as the Cold War itself. So we have lots of information what happened after. And when you are talking about all these agencies and ideological divide between East and West, would you evaluate that things were more active and efficient? Maybe efficient, it would be too much, but were these organizations more active at that time than after? Like in 1990s, when there was no Cold War, how do you feel like they all sighed and said, oh, finally, we don't have to waste our energy on the Cold War debates, and now we will become more efficient in the world? And would you evaluate that they became more efficient or not?
No, I think they were much more active in the Cold War period than they have been since then. For a lot of reasons that I cannot enter, but they have been much more active, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And in particular, the kind of one of the reasons is that the countries give less and less money, so they're more and more dependent on private grants. And in particular, the World Health Organization, as we know, is almost entirely dependent on private foundations, and in particular, the Gates Foundation. So their program is really structured around this kind of grants, money that they get, and everybody, the officials, and now there is also something else, is that some of the governments, particularly the US government, they want to destroy the secretariat. They want to destroy the officials. They want not to pay officials anymore because they're saying that they are useless and that they just want to send their own people. And of course, if you destroy the secretariat of an international organization, you have no international organization anymore. That's the end of it. So, but there is a real discussion on that because international civil servants, they have a certain status which has been put in place in the interwar year, particularly in the ILO, International Labour Organization, that they have to say and to commit to the international organization before the national their nation. They really have to commit to that. They say we are international civil servants, and we will obey the international organization before the nation state, before their governments. That's something which for some of them is very complicated to do. Very complicated. So if you destroy the secretariat, you destroy this commitment to internationalism in a certain way, and that's the end of international organization. And it's a real threat right now. So I wouldn't say that future looks very bright. No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay, so on this sobering note, thank you so much.
Yeah.